Chapter 25. Fort Laurel, California. The Present. Dieter pulled up at the gate of Fort Laurel and waited for the MPs on duty to come out. He felt a moment of nostalgia. Going through perimeter security was something he'd done most days of his life for 20 years. Sometimes legitimately on his way to work. Sometimes under assumed identities, very illegitimately. Also on his way to work. He'd borrowed the Chamberlain's Army surplus Humvee on the off chance that Cyberdyne could identify him and Sarah by their vehicle. In the back, he'd placed a case of the expensive and very hard to find Danish beer that Ferry liked. The man was a real connoisseur. He sneered at mere Tuborg as fit for only peasants, barely better than Swedish brews. The MP at the desk looked him over thoroughly before he picked up his clipboard and came out of the shack, narrow-eyed and slow. He was backed up by another soldier with a rifle, who moved to the right fender and stood at the ready. Dieter had his passport in hand and passed it over to the MP without being asked. "I'm here to see Major Ferry," he said. Then he went silent, keeping his face turned towards the MP, who read the passport, as well as he could, it being in Spanish. The MP looked from the passport to von Rossbach several times, as though comparing individual features. Dieter was amused by his thoroughness. When it all came down, it wasn't going to be because this kid hadn't made sure of his identity. "Are you boys expecting any trouble?" he asked as the MP checked the back seat. "Always, sir," the MP answered. He went around to the back and lifted the canvas cover. "What's in the box?" "Beer." Which was obvious. The name was all over the case. "I meant in the locker behind it, sir." "A blanket, a toolkit, a flashlight," Dieter answered. "Some flares, stuff like that." If it had been anyone else but the Major's guest, the MP would have asked the big man to open the trunk. "You may proceed, sir," he said. Without waiting to be asked, he provided instructions to the Major's lodgings. "Thank you," Dieter said amiably. "You're welcome, sir." Dieter glanced in the rearview mirror as he drove off and saw the rifleman watching the Humvee for a moment before going back to the guard shack. It gave him a sense of unease, as though they knew more than they should. "Calm down," he told himself. "The last I heard, even the best MPs didn't have X-ray vision." "You okay in there?" he asked Sarah. There was a sharp tap from inside the trunk in answer. The code was once for yes, twice for no. He'd be glad when she could get out of there. The very thought of her crammed into that tiny space was giving him claustrophobia. And Sarah, only mentally present, was even harder to take than the silent accusation that had been pouring out of her when she was there physically. Not the least of the shock was realizing how much he cared about her opinion. Ferry's place was relatively easy to find, one of a row of base housing looking like a marked-down suburb 2 decades out of date, with plenty of kids and dogs. The Major was sitting in a lawn chair out front, waiting. He checked his watch. "On time as ever," the Major said, rising. Dieter grinned and waved. Then he lifted the canvas and dragged out the case of beer. Ferry's face lit up and he waved his arms in a mock bow. "I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy," he said with a grin. "You know what? You're right," Dieter said. "I'll take it back and get a refund." Alarm flashed across the Major's face, and he rushed forward to gently remove the case from von Rossbach's arms. "No, no, no," he said. "You just let me take care of these babies." He cocked his head towards his front door. "Come on in. Set a spell. Tell me what you've been doing." "In a word, cows," Dieter said, surrendering the carton. He glanced at a grill by the corner of the house as he opened the door. "You're not going to barbecue anything, are you?" "I thought you might be homesick," Ferry said innocently. "Kung Pao chicken," he said. "My best chicken dish." The Major led him into a small, sparsely furnished living room. Ferry had never been one to put his imprint on his quarters, probably because, early in his career, he'd been on the move so much. A lot of guys acquired souvenirs of the places they'd been to, but Ferry found they lost their charm fast when you had to pack up and move them 20 or 30 times. In the kitchen, he put his prize down on a grey and red Formica table, then ripped open the box and pulled out a sweating bottle. "Hey, it's cold," he said in delight. "Well, I knew you would want one straight away," Dieter said. He reached in and took one out for himself. Ferry produced an opener and they sat down at the table. For a moment, all that could be heard was men swallowing good beer. The kitchen was full of late afternoon sunlight and smelled fantastic, suffused with the rich aromas of good cooking. The counter bore evidence of much meat and vegetable chopping having taken place. "When do we eat?" Dieter asked, a greedy look on his face. "'Bout 20 minutes," Ferry said with a grin. "You hungry?" "Now I am," von Rossbach said fervently. Grinning, Ferry brought out a plate of cheese and a box of crackers. "Don't eat too much," he cautioned. "But good cheese does go well with good beer." Sarah waited for what seemed forever, 10 minutes as the universe counted time. Then, when she heard no sounds from outside the Humvee, she pushed against the front of the locker with her hands and knees. It slid out slow and even, and for a moment she just lay on her side breathing the sweet, clean air that cooled her face and chest. She rolled out, pulled out her supplies, and after a brief struggle in the semi-darkness, pushed the false front of the trunk back into place. Cautiously, she sat up. Lifting the edge of the canvas, she quickly checked the area around the car. People were visible in the distance, but their attention was elsewhere. Excellent. They hadn't aroused the guard's suspicions. She could neither hear nor see Dieter or his friend. The coast was clear. Sarah sat for a while, letting the worst of the sweat dry from her face and hair. She'd been in the trunk only about 30 minutes, but it had quickly become stiflingly hot. Sensibly, she'd not donned her uniform blouse, and it waited beside her to be put on. About her hair, there wasn't much she could do. At least it was short. Maybe anyone who noticed it was wet would think she'd just taken a shower. 10 minutes later, she was striding away from the Humvee in the direction of the Cyberdyne facility. Information John had teased out of the contaminated brain of the Terminator they'd destroyed. She carried a battered brown briefcase and wore the boxy camo fatigues of the modern army, with an MP armband circling her sleeve and a peaked cap worn level on her head. In the briefcase were a set of detonators, timers, and several tools that would hasten her work. They'd made the fairly safe assumption that they would find everything else they'd need at the site. "We did the last time I blew up Cyberdyne," she thought grimly, In the pocket of her fatigue jacket was a taser. It looked almost exactly like one of the bulkier cell phones on the market. The taser they'd adapted to disrupt a Terminator's electronics was clipped to her belt. She really didn't expect to find a Terminator minding the front desk after all, and that one would fry a human, so she didn't want to get them mixed up. Sarah crossed what felt like a mile of the compound before coming in sight of Cyberdyne. She kept her eyes front, and by her manner indicated that she knew exactly where she was going and exactly what she was doing. No one gave her a second look. She boldly approached Cyberdyne's glass front door and pulled the handle. Nothing happened. I guess maybe they're waiting for us. Her breath grew shaky and her palms began to sweat. The glass was tinted. From 4 feet away, it might as well have been opaque. Sarah leaned forward and made out a man behind a desk, watching her. She tapped on the glass and waved the security guard towards her. He mouthed, "We're closed." She took the taser out of her pocket and pretended it was a phone. Lowering her head, she put it to her ear. She continued to wave the guard towards her, looking up at him from under the rim of her hat. He kept waving his hands in a negative sign and saying that they were closed, and she continued to alternately tap on the door and to wave him forward. At last, looking intensely exasperated, he pushed himself up from his seat and came to the door. Unlocking it, he pushed it open a few inches. "We are closed," he enunciated. "Hold on, please," Sarah said to the taser. "I have an appointment," she said to the guard. "There's nobody here," he insisted. "The place is empty." "Check your appointment book," Sarah said. "I'll be listed." He glanced at the MP armband and looked uncertain. Sarah, holding the taser against her shoulder as though she didn't want it to overhear, sighed noisily. "Will you just check? Please," she said. "I'm sure I would have been contacted if my appointment was cancelled." "Well," he said, "I guess Ms. Burns is still here." "That's who I was supposed to see," Sarah told him. "Could you please just let me in and tell her I'm here?" He stood, looking at her uncertainly. "Sometime today would be good," she said sarcastically. The guard stood back and gestured her in with his head. Then he locked the door behind them and led her to the desk. He sat down and called up a page on the computer. "I'm sorry about this," Sarah said quietly. The guard turned towards her and she triggered the taser. The twin cords shot out with an electronic zring, hitting him full in the stomach. He went down and bounced and jittered on the floor, while 50,000 volts shot through his body and his muscles convulsed. Sarah pressed the button that released the cords, snapped a new set into the taser's base, and stepped over his body before he even became still. Placing her briefcase on the desk, she opened it and took out some duct tape. Bending over the guard, she checked his pulse. Fast, but steady. Then she slapped a piece of tape over his mouth and turned him over. With a few quick moves, she had him bound, feet to wrists, and more securely gagged. Quickly, she patted him over and withdrew his master keycard. Then she shoved him under the desk. Glancing at the computer, she noticed the page she'd brought up had been replaced by a prompt that asked what information the guard was looking for. She typed in games, hoping that anyone watching over the system, if anyone was, would assume that a bored guard was looking for entertainment. The computer responded with a full-page scolding about playing games on company time. Sarah raised an eyebrow. They can't seriously imagine that anyone is going to the trouble of reading all of that, she thought. It's a self-administered spanking. She tapped in the sequence that John had given them, and it brought up security. With a few taps, she disabled the silent alarm. Something I should have done last time, she thought bitterly. Then she brought up the door locks and changed the entry code to test mode, one that only she, John, and Dieter knew. Then she shut the computer down and rose. Sarah looked around. The guard's desk stood alone in a very unwelcoming lobby. No chairs for the comfort of waiting visitors, no plants to soften the harsh lines of the place. Just a polished floor and the desk, behind which was a short, wide corridor that ended in a pair of double doors. This led to the storage area, where she hoped to find her bomb-making materials. On either side of the corridor were a pair of elevators. The desk itself was one of those that had a high shelf in front, with the desk space consisting of another shelf below. Even when he wasn't tied up underneath it, the guard would be very hard to see from the front. Which is a plus, Sarah thought. Some passerby glancing through the door wouldn't really expect to see anyone. She stood still, listening carefully. There was no sound but the sigh of the air conditioning, and the air it put out had the utter sterility of a high-priced recirculation system. Apparently, the guard hadn't been kidding. No one was here. No one but Miss Burns, that is, whoever she is. A group of monitors on the guard's desk showed her from several angles, so there were several cameras mounted around the place. But she saw no point in worrying about them. If she succeeded, they'd soon be so much melted plastic, along with their tapes. If she failed, Cyberdyne would know who had invaded them anyway. Snapping her briefcase closed, she took the key out of her pocket and jogged towards the storage area. The door opened smoothly on first try. Sarah let out her breath in relief. She'd been half expecting an alarm to go off, or for some secret code to be required. Sarah entered a warehouse-sized space and made a little sound of despair. This is going to take longer than I'd hoped. She looked around and noticed a bank of elevators along the front wall, flanking the corridor. The elevators had front and back doors. How sensible, she thought in surprise. They've actually made it convenient for people to get supplies. She'd assumed that she would have to drag everything out front, risking discovery. This is going to be a snap, she thought. Fort Laurel Base Hospital, the present. John looked around the room through slitted eyes. He was in a state of well-controlled terror, not knowing whom he was with or where he was. He couldn't see much, but he saw enough to know that he wasn't alone. A man's legs, with one foot crossed over his knee, were visible off to the side. He was in a hospital room, from what he could see. There was another bed to his left, but it was empty. The door to the hall was closed. He lay still, which wasn't hard. He was feeling very weak. Better, though. Someone's given me fluids and a trank. I should hurt more. Head's a little fuzzy. The door opened and a grey-haired man with glasses came in. From his white coat, he was a doctor. "Isn't he awake yet?" the doctor asked, moving quickly to John's side. He took up the boy's wrist and checked his pulse. If he is, he hasn't said anything, Dyson said. He sounded tired, but John was grateful to hear his voice. If Dyson was still here, maybe he wasn't going to be turned over to the master Terminator. The doctor reached over and lifted one of John's eyelids. He turned on a pen light and John blinked involuntarily. Aha! Playing possum, were you? The doctor said cheerfully. Well, I need to ask you a few questions, then you can go back to sleep, if you like. He asked a few brisk questions to test memory and visual acuteness. Are you in any pain? He asked finally. I'm comfortable, John said. Really? The doctor glanced at his watch. Some people have a pretty high threshold of pain, but yours is remarkable. You should be very aware of that shoulder right now, since you're due for a shot of Demerol. I'm fine, John said again. I don't like drugs. I wish more of your generation felt that way, the doctor said, making a note on the chart. Are you hungry? John nodded, his eyes closed. He wasn't hungry, but his mother would have insisted that he eat to keep up his strength. Besides, he thought he would feel better if he ate. I'll have them send up something then, the doctor said. Something light, some soup and some jello. Thank you, John said. The doctor gave him a quick, dry smile, then looked at Jordan. You? He asked. Yeah, please, Dyson said. I haven't wanted to leave. I could use something to eat. The doctor nodded, glanced at John one last time. Then he left. John turned his head and looked at Dyson. Thank you, he said. Jordan rubbed his stubbled face. For? He asked. For not turning me over to them. John's face was serious. They will kill me if you do that, he said. He raised his brows. And it may be a cliché, but I'm too young to die. Dyson snorted. Me too, he agreed. Where am I? John asked. You're in the base hospital at Fort Laurel. Jordan watched John take a breath that was almost like a sob, then go still. I haven't reported to my boss, if that's what you're wondering. John let out his breath slowly and closed his eyes. I was, he admitted. He looked over at Dyson. Why not? Jordan grimaced. Teresa told me the full story a few weeks ago, he said. I thought she was the victim of some sort of traumatic stress, Stockholm syndrome combination. I mean, she bought into your mother's delusion so completely. He looked over at the boy. I've known that woman since I was a kid, and I always thought of her as one of the most sensible, sanest people I know. And then she dumps that on me. Only it's true, John said. Yeah, right. Dyson sneered. There was a knock on the door, and an attendant thrust it open with his foot. Dr. Huff ordered this for you, he said, holding out a tray. Jordan got up and took it from him. Thanks, he said. The tray held a bowl of soup, a dish of green jello, a cup of orange juice, a sandwich, and a carton of milk. The sandwich is mine, I guess, Jordan said. Do you want the OJ or the milk? OJ, Connor said, I need the sugar. Jordan's brows went up. If you say so. John took a sip of the juice and held it in his dry mouth. I know how you feel, you know, he said. When I was 10, I thought my mother was a complete psycho. Then one day, 2 Terminators showed up, one to kill me, one to save me. He shook his head, then closed his eyes and reminded himself not to do that. It was the craziest 48 hours of my life. So far. John looked Dyson in the eye. I don't want this to be true. It just happens to be true. If they find me, they will kill me. And I guarantee you they are looking for me. So what I need to know is, did you leave any kind of trail at all? What do you mean? Like credit card charges? Jordan asked. What? You think I was stopping in bars? I was thinking of phone calls, John said. Jordan bit his lip. I called to make these arrangements from a payphone, using a calling card. But that was from the last place I contacted Cyberdyne, so that wouldn't tell them anything. Oh, I called when we were about 20 minutes from here to tell my friend when we'd arrive. Were the card and the phone issued by Cyberdyne? Connor asked. Yeah. Jordan bit into his sandwich and wondered where the kid was going with this. Get rid of them, John said. He could hear the tension in his own voice. Anything they've given you probably has the capacity to listen in or trace you. Well, they haven't so far, Jordan said casually. And we've been here all night and all day, which, if they were looking for us, they would have done. Maybe they're waiting for dark, John said, glancing at the window. They had plenty of dark last night, Jordan pointed out, his mouth full of apparently irreducible bread. He took a sip of milk. So that doesn't work. If they suspected I'd convinced you, John said musingly, they would assume you'd be too vigilant to attack last night. But tonight, your belief would be fading. You'd be wondering if you'd done the right thing, so you'd be a lot safer to attack. Connor looked at him measuringly. Maybe it won't even be an attack. Maybe your Ms. Burns will just sashay in here and ask you what's going on. He raised his brows. What would you say then? I don't know, Jordan said honestly. Maybe something like, I got crazy. I don't know what came over me. The kid talked me into it. Jordan rolled up his napkin and tossed it into the wastebasket. When Serena Burns next sees me, the first words out of her mouth are going to be, "You're fired." He looked over at John. After that, she might ask me just what the hell I thought I was doing. But since I'm fired, it won't really matter what I say, now will it? Would you let them take me away? John asked. He had no idea how young he looked to Jordan at that moment, lying pale and weak in the bed, dark circles under his eyes, his hair tousled on the pillow. Jordan thought of what Teresa had told him. He thought of Danny and the look on his nephew's face before he slammed the door on him. They believed in this kid and his mother. From what they told him, they had good reason to believe him. More important, Miles had believed in them. Could he do less? No, he said at last. I wouldn't. John almost wept with relief. His eyes filled and his throat tightened. He took a deep breath and forced himself to relax. Nobody pays attention like a crying kid. Certainly, if you act certain, people pick it up. After a minute, he spoke. Then you have to get me out of here, man. Jordan looked at the door as though he expected someone to come bursting through it at those words. He leaned close. "Where do you want me to take you?" he said quietly. John thought for a moment. "How long have I been here?" he asked. "All last night and all day today." Jordan frowned. He'd already told him that. Maybe the head wound was making him forgetful. John blew out his breath. "Then this is the day we were going to attack Cyberdyne," he said. He looked over at Jordan. "You have to take me there." "To Cyberdyne?" Jordan asked. "Are you crazy? What about all those Terminators over there who'd want you dead?" "My mother's going to be there," John said. "Oh." Jordan straightened up and rolled his eyes. "Why didn't you say so? I guess I'd better go find you some clothes. You can hide out in my office. No, wait, that won't work, because as soon as I show up, I'm going to get fired and I won't have an office." John smiled. "Seriously," he said, "it's the last place the Terminators will be looking for me. They know I'm wounded. They'll expect me to be lying low. They might even be counting on my mother nursing me back to health in some remote location, but she'll be there. I swear she will." Jordan tightened his lips, but he could see that the kid was serious. "Like I said, I'd better go get you some clothes," he muttered. Ralph's Kung Pao chicken tasted as good as it smelled. Dieter felt like a heel rewarding such a good dinner with what was going to be the mother of all headaches. But there was no help for it. While Ferry's back was turned, he put the drops in his friend's beer. Ralph turned back and put a brimming plate in front of Dieter, then sat down to his own. He licked his thumb and said, "I think I made just enough, which is to say enough for 6. Ferry grinned, hoisted his bottle in a toast to von Rossbach, and took a long swig. "Where did you find these?" he asked. "I've looked everywhere. I asked them to order it for me at the PX, but I knew when I did, they'd never be able to score this stuff." "I have my ways," Dieter said mysteriously. He took a sip from his own bottle. Ferry snorted and drank from his own. "Actually, there's this place in LA that stocks it. It's called Ron's Imported Beers on East Alameda. They're in the book. Unfortunately, they don't deliver." Ralph grinned, already looking a little bleary. "Even if they did, I'm probably outside their delivery zone," he said. They talked and ate for a minute more. Then, without warning, Ferry's head hit the table. Dieter winced, then moved the dish of chicken out from under his friend's face. He leaned over to make sure the Major could still breathe, then headed for Ferry's bedroom. In a minute, he was dressed in the Major's fatigues and was headed out the door in the direction of Cyberdyne. "I wonder how far Sarah got," he thought. He shouldn't be worried, he knew. Sarah Connor was very professional, but he was emotionally involved, whether he liked it or not. So he worried. What if they have John there? He wondered. He knew Sarah thought that if her son wasn't dead, he was a prisoner of Cyberdyne. So, did she get right to work, or did she search for him? Most mothers, you wouldn't even have to ask that question, but Sarah Connor wasn't most mothers. He couldn't help but be concerned. She had been absolutely cold since they'd taken John. So withdrawn, she might actually have been living in another time and place. Visible, able to interact, yet untouchable. Dieter didn't think that John was dead because the man who had ordered the Terminators to chase them hadn't come after them. If the boy had been dead, he would have followed them and tried to help with the capture. Sarah didn't buy it. She resisted the urge to hope, believing it a fool's game. You could almost see John falling, the blood, the boneless landing, in her eyes. She'd told him that if the first shot didn't kill him, then they would do it at their leisure, but that they would kill him. If they have him, he's dead, she'd said to him in a voice and manner that brooked no argument. And so he approached Cyberdyne looking determined but feeling discouraged. From what Sarah had told him, if John was dead, then humanity's only hope was the total destruction of Cyberdyne. And that looks damn near hopeless. The place was like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more pop out. Fort Laurel Base Hospital, the present. No, I'll go out first, then you. I can steady you and catch you if you fall. You don't want to risk that shoulder. John frowned at Jordan's suggestion, not because it was a bad idea, but because it was so obviously a good one. He felt strange, distant and distracted, which he supposed was due to the drugs and the loss of blood. But this was a bad time to be slow as an ox. Good thinking, he said aloud. You go first. Jordan slipped over the narrow metal windowsill without comment. The drop from the boy's room was about 4 feet. Not bad, but still enough to be bothersome if one arm was out of action. John followed him immediately, barely giving Jordan a chance to step back. Dyson put his hands on the boy's slim waist and eased him down. Then he looked around. The coast was still clear. John was wearing his own jeans and sneakers, but Jordan had found a green surgical shirt to replace the bloodied and torn t-shirt he had been wearing. Dyson looked down at his own rumpled and blood-stained suit. We couldn't be more obvious on an army base if we were wearing rubber hoses and orange wigs, he thought. Dyson looked around. It was just getting dark. Things were getting hard to see, and the camp lights wouldn't be going on for a couple of minutes yet. There was no good time to do this, but right now was better than some. They started off. By the time they reached Cyberdyne, it was full dark. There were pockets of shadow here and there around the building, looking all the darker for the arc lights surrounding them. They headed for a well of shadow at the back of the building. John stumbled and nearly went down, but Jordan caught him, awkwardly because he was trying to avoid the wounded shoulder. To a passerby, it would have looked like they were struggling. In fact, to Dieter, it did. He moved up silently behind Jordan and, clasping his big hands together, brought them down on the back of Dyson's neck. Jordan moved slightly at the last minute, reducing some of the force of the blow, but he went down in a heap, and John dropped with him. Ow! John said, looking up into Dieter's grave face. Jordan rolled over onto his back. His eyes wandered for a moment, then focused. What the hell did you do that for? He whispered. Dieter, no! John barked as Dieter brought his arm back for the coup de grace. He's on our side! Dieter relaxed, looking down at Dyson. Looking up, Jordan could discern no expression in his attacker's face or eyes, and he was ready to believe that this man was even more dangerous than the resume Serena had given him said he was. Assuming this was von Rossbach. Then Dieter looked at John and smiled. "Your mother is going to be relieved to see you," he said fervently. He offered his hand to help John up. "Let's roll." John's eyes widened. "Terminal mission override, XY74!" he snapped. Dieter spun around and gasped in surprise. He was face to face with a Terminator, a thing with his face. He fumbled at his belt for the taser. The Terminator was frozen by the dissonance of an imperative command phrase uttered at the wrong time by the wrong person for the wrong purpose. Its processor worked furiously to reroute its command tree. For a second or two, it stood helpless, so much inanimate metal and plastic. Triggering the taser, von Rossbach stepped to the side, placing himself in front of the boy. Then they all scrambled back as sparks burst from the Terminator's eyes and mouth, its arms flopping wildly and legs stamping in place. Finally, it stopped, frozen, with one foot in the air. Then slowly, with the majesty of a Sakia, it fell, face forward, at their feet. John looked around, then picked up a white-painted rock, and moving over to the Terminator, began calmly slamming it on the thing's head. "Thanks," Dieter gasped. "De nada," Connor responded, never letting up the rhythm of his pounding. "I got the phrase out of the CPU of that Terminator we decapitated. I wasn't sure if it was genuine, but looks like." Shaken, but not to be outdone in cool, Jordan said, "We'd better get moving. Those fireworks might have attracted unwelcome attention." Christ, it's real. He felt himself going into shock and hauled back from the precipice with a gasping effort of sheer willpower. "I'll have the nervous breakdown later." "Can you really kill one of those things with a rock?" Dieter asked. "No, but you can expose the access plate. Here we go." John peeled back an arc of scalp, opened the plate, poised the pointed end of the rock, and struck twice. Sort of ironic. Man's earliest tool, killing his last. The big man looked at him, and John went on with a grin. "So I'm old beyond my years. So sue me." John watched the red light of one eye flicker and fade, then dropped the rock. "Yeah," he agreed. "We'd better get bolts here out of sight before we go, though." Dieter clipped the taser back onto his belt and leaned down. Grabbing one of the Terminator's arms, he tugged and grunted. "He's heavy," he said in surprise, his voice showing the strain of dragging roughly 300 pounds of inert mass. Jordan took the other arm, and they finally got it moving. They dragged, then pushed it into the shadows. "Mom's already here?" John asked as they started off. "She should be," Dieter said. "What do you Americans say? One big, happy family." "Christ," Jordan muttered. Cyberdyne, the present. Sarah rolled the last barrel into the fourth elevator and took it to the lowest level, 4. She'd already filled all the other elevators with the makings she'd flung together and sent them to the other floors. Cyberdyne's equivalent of a quartermaster seemed to love ordering in bulk and she'd taken full advantage of his or her thriftiness. I could come up with the makings for a bomb in a public restroom, she thought. Fruits of a not-so-misspent life. One the waitress student she'd once been would have found incomprehensible and terrifying in equal measure. This abundance of stuff was pure luxury. The one thing they didn't seem to have an ample supply of was dollies. She'd been able to only find one. When the door opened on 4, she tipped the barrel she'd loaded and raced for the far end of the complex. Only 15 more to go, she thought. Dieter tapped in the test code and the door lock disconnected with a harsh buzzing sound. The three of them pushed through the doors and rushed towards the desk. John slapped von Rossbach on the arm and pointed to the elevator indicator lights. One car was stopped on each floor. Hey, if a guy can't depend on his mother, who can he rely on? This is her most excellent MO, believe me. He went over to the elevators and pushed the button for the one stopped on 4. Nothing happened. She's got the door propped open, he said. Excitement seemed to be lending him energy. I'm going down there to help her spread the bombs, he said, and headed for the emergency stairs. John, wait! Dieter called out, but the boy was already through the door. He turned to Jordan. Is there anybody here? Usually on a Sunday there are 6 security people and a few scientists working, and maybe 1 or 2 eager beaver executives, he said. He thought for a moment. If I know Serena Burns, she's probably arranged for the place to be empty. Dyson turned to the security desk and blinked at the sight of the guard, now slowly returning to consciousness, stuffed under the desk. Jordan shook his head and blew out his breath. Get on with it, he ordered himself. Don't ask questions, don't think, just do it. He set the monitors to show what was happening on each floor. Most of the scenes shown were devoid of human presence. On 4, something flashed by too fast to register. Sarah, von Rossbach said, pointing a thick finger at the monitor. And John, Dyson said, indicating a monitor that showed the boy creeping through a door marked with a big 3. The rest of the security cameras flashed views of the areas covered, showing 2 security guards, and no one else. Those are the ones Serena sent with me to Sacramento, Jordan said. Terminators, Dieter growled, looking grim. We'd better tell John and his mother, Jordan said. I'll take care of John, von Rossbach said. Sarah has a taser with her that will take down a Terminator. The boy has nothing. Just teenage hubris, Jordan thought. Is this Serena person likely to be here? Dieter asked. Jordan nodded solemnly. The kid thought she might be the one in charge of all the Terminators we've been running into. Dieter froze in thought, looking for all the world like the Terminator he'd disabled outside. Can you distract her? He asked. Jordan rubbed his jaw, then shrugged. I can try, he said. I'll come up with some story about what happened. That might keep her occupied for a little while. I don't think she'll buy anything I come up with, though. That woman is smart. If John is right, that woman isn't a woman, Dieter said. Go ahead, do what you can. I'll go help John. Jordan glanced at the elevators, then followed Dieter to the stairs. He wasn't sure what was up with that, but it wasn't an arrangement he wanted to mess with. "Wait," he said. He went back to the guard's desk and shut each camera down individually. Then he fixed it so that they could only be turned on again using a new password. Fear. Which I expect to experience more of tonight. He stood up and blew out his breath. I guess that means I've crossed the Rubicon for certain, he thought. Okay, he said aloud. Let's go. Von Rossbach nodded, and they headed out. Serena sat behind her desk, hands primly folded before her, and worked the last conversation she'd collected between John Connor and Dyson through a series of filters. For some reason, once he'd entered the base hospital, reception had been extremely poor. The I-950 had been working on it for half an hour now, using a reconstruction algorithm, and still couldn't make out what they were saying through the static. Once Jordan had begun speaking again, shortly before he returned to the base, she'd been relieved. Knowing that the boy was at hand, if not actually in her hands, was satisfactory. She knew where he was, and from what she'd heard, he wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. At least not pumped up with Demerol he isn't, she thought. For now, she was content to ignore him. Serena had bigger fish to fry. Sarah Connor, to be exact. She'll be here soon. Everything currently known about the woman promised it. 5 was patrolling outside, as were 2 of the human security guards. One of those she'd put near the gate with orders to report anything strange. The other she'd assigned to the hospital, where he was watching Connor's room. 6 and 7 were on independent patrol of the complex. Now it was just a matter of waiting. The I-950 looked up in surprise at the tapping on her door. "Come in," she said. Serena came as close as she ever had in her life to dropping her jaw in astonishment. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her long legs. "Well," she said slowly, "this is a surprise." He came in and slumped towards her desk, head down, looking tired, rumpled and sheepish. "So, what happened?" she demanded. "Speak to me, Jordan." He leaned both hands on the back of the chair across the desk from her, pressed his lips together, and looked off to the side. "Jordan," she said, looking at him from under her brows. "Have you lost your voice?" She upped her hearing level and found that his heart was beating rather rapidly. Meaning? She wondered. It could simply mean that he expected to be fired, or that he had hard questions for her. Or it could mean something more dangerous. "No," he said, raising his hand. He looked her in the eye. "Let me tell you what he told me," Jordan suggested. She raised her brows. "If you think it will help," she said laconically. He blew out his breath and began to speak, his eyes keeping contact with hers. He told her about the Terminators and how they had ruthlessly pursued the Connors, of how Connor was convinced that the 3 men she'd sent with him were nothing less than contemporary versions of the enemy they'd met before. She listened quietly, taking note of the micro tremors in his voice more than of what he was saying. He's scared, she thought. Because he believes them? or because he expects to be humiliated for that belief. For a human, one could be as disturbing as the other. She had time. Let him grab enough rope to hang himself. It wasn't as though he was going to survive this, no matter what he said. When he was finished, Serena pursed her lips and steepled her fingers before her. It's a remarkably self-consistent set of delusions. She looked him in the eye. Isn't it? He nodded and slapped the edge of the seat in front of him. Yes, it is. So am I fired or what? She laughed outright at that and spread her hands. You still haven't told me what happened, Jordan. Give me something to base a judgment on, why don't you? He straightened, then looked to the side again, as though gathering his thoughts. Now was the moment of truth. Was he on her side or the Connors? Did he believe Teresa or Serena? Suddenly, he thought of John telling him that Serena must be very, very smart. And it shook him. Yeah, she is smart, he thought. And if Connor is right, then she might have resources that we don't. He's a very persuasive boy, Jordan began. And those guys you sent with me were insanely out of line. He rested his hands on the chair back. Maybe I bought into it a little. He met her eyes. So I brought him to the base hospital instead of here. I stayed with him last night, and I thought about it. Serena looked at him, swinging her chair slightly from side to side. And what did you conclude? She asked. He shrugged, looking down. To be honest, maybe I'm too tired to think straight, but the jury is still out. She laughed again. Yes, I'm afraid you are too tired to think straight. I suggest you not try to buy a used car today, if you're capable of buying the crap that poor kid took in with his pabulum. Serena uncrossed her legs and scooted her chair under her desk, folding her hands before her. What did you tell them at the hospital? She asked, all business now. That I didn't think our clinic could handle the kid's wounds, and that his life depended on his presence being kept secret. He shrugged. I told Ferry that Tricker would want him to cooperate with us on this one. The I-950 looked thoughtful. He was telling the truth, at least for the most part, judging from the micro tremors in his voice. Good, she said with satisfaction. You're probably right about the hospital having a better chance of treating him too. We do have just a small clinic. So, I'm not totally dissatisfied with your performance on this. I should have expected it, given your concern over the boy's wounds. And he is at hand, if needed. She looked at him, her head tipped to one side. Then she lowered her eyes. I guess the jury is still out for both of us. How this all works out will determine your future with Cyberdyne, she said. Now, why don't you go back home and get a few hours rest? I'd like you to come back in tonight. That's when I think she'll strike. Sometime between midnight and dawn. Tonight? He said. Something in his voice alerted her. She extended her hearing and caught the sound of an elevator. Not her Terminators. They'd been instructed to use the stairs at all times in order to avoid human contact. The only human in the building beside Jordan was the guard on the desk, who hadn't let her know she had a visitor. She checked the security cams and found them offline. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't turn them on again. She had gone so still that she might as well have been a mannequin. Jordan knew instinctively that something had gone very wrong. He took a giant step towards the door. His hand was on the knob when she flew over her desk towards him. How he did it, he never knew, but he was through the door and slamming it behind him before she could get her hands on him. He ran flat out for the elevators. Serena was through in a split second, her beautiful face completely expressionless, almost serene, as the door flew back hard enough to shatter the knob and tear the lock out of the plywood frame. At first, he flung things in her path, a chair, someone's computer, anything he could get his hands on. But he saw when he looked over his shoulder that she leaped over everything like a gazelle, her hair almost brushing the ceiling. After that, he just ran, arms pumping, legs flying. It seemed like miles. There was one last door ahead, the glass barrier between the scientists and the executive territory. He swished his card through the reader and a green dot lit. The door clicked and he was through. The door slid shut behind him. He picked up a potted palm and threw it at the lock mechanism outside the door, which broke with a shower of sparks. Serena was nearly to the door. He turned, crossed the corridor, and hit the elevator button. The doors opened and he flew inside. Jordan turned and pressed a button, any button, then watched helplessly as the demon approached. Serena slammed into the door and bounced off, looking faintly surprised. Then, knowing she had him trapped, a slow, satisfied grin animated her face. She drew back her fist and punched forward. Safety glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, and she leaped through. As the elevator doors closed, he saw her expression change to chagrin, and the last he saw of her was her fingertips reaching for the door. Then she was gone, and the elevator was on the move. Jordan plastered himself against the side of the car and gasped for breath. Then he slid down the wall and sat for a moment, gathering his strength. Opening his eyes, he smiled. Then he looked to the side and froze. The elevator was full of bomb. Serena hit the elevator door hard enough to dent it. She let loose a strangled cry of frustration, then quickly stifled it. "Where are you?" she sent to the Terminators. "Two," one of them answered. "One," the other replied. The third didn't answer. Serena watched the elevator indicator. Dyson was going down. He was already past 2. "There's at least one human invader in the building," she told them. "Jordan Dyson. Terminate him on sight." 5 came towards her from the far end of the corridor. A pity it hadn't been closer when Dyson ran. They could have cornered him between them. "Go to the ground floor," she said. "Guard the elevators and the door to the stairs. Terminate any human who comes through them." She looked up. Dyson had gone all the way down to 4. There was a panel on the wall that controlled the elevators. She ripped off the cover and grabbed a handful of wires, then pulled them from their moorings. That ought to keep him where she wanted him for a while. She signaled 6 to meet her there. The I-950 turned and headed for the stairs. She had a small but powerful gun holstered at the small of her back under her suit jacket. A snub-barreled Magnum that a human her size couldn't have controlled. Pulling it out, she clicked off the safety and made sure she had a round in the chamber. Hunting humans, she thought. How nice. Seems an age since I did this.